This lesson's on evolution by natural selection, and here's the objectives. Now, when we say evolution in a biological context, we mean descent with modification. So it's the idea that all organisms come from a unified tree of life, but as they reproduce and have offspring and move into different environments, they start to differ from each other as they accumulate adaptations. And an adaptation is an inherited trait that helps fit an organism to a particular environment. By fit here, I mean it helps suit that organism to a particular environment so it can exploit some part of the environment for resources, etc. An adaptation could be structural. For example, an organism that has a hinged jaw might have an advantage in an environment over one that doesn't. It could be biochemical, for example, the ability to perform aerobic respiration and therefore unlock more energy from fuels. It could be behavioral, so for example, being nocturnal, which might keep you out of the way of predators. So if adaptations accumulate in populations as they descend from a common ancestor, then this organism here will differ from its ancestor and will also differ from another organism that has descended through another line. And you might be able to see that if enough adaptations build up so that these two organisms are very different from each other, then they could even become different species. And so evolution by natural selection is a way that we could develop different species. Let's take a look at an example to make this a little clearer. Imagine that we have a population of organisms. I'm going to just call them blobs. Here's one of them, here's a shorter one of them, and we've got a variety of different heights of these blobs. And they're living, let's say, in a mountainous area, and there's not a whole lot of food in that mountainous area, but they're getting by okay. And then one day, some of the smaller ones of them discover a little opening in the rock through which they can go back and forth, and on the other side of that, they discover a grassy meadow that has lots of flowers that they can eat. So now the shorter ones of these blobs can move back and forth and exploit the resources over here. But the larger blobs can't. They can't fit through. Only the smaller ones can. And as a result, they're going to be able to better survive, and they're going to be able to better reproduce. And if their offspring resemble them in their height, in other words, if height is a heritable trait with a genetic component, then in the next generation of these blobs, we will see more short phenotypes because their parents, who were short, survived better and reproduced better. So this is evolution by natural selection. The selection is happening right here. This little opening in the rock is selecting for smaller blobs, giving them an advantage, and it's natural because it's a feature of the natural environment. It's not being imposed by humans. We've got descent with modification happening here. The population as a whole is becoming shorter, and that short stature is an adaptation. It's fitting the organism to this particular environment where short stature is an advantage. Also notice that we've got some things here that are random and some things that are not. The height variability is random. Whether you are a tall blob or a short blob, that's random to an extent, but the selection here, the size of the doorway, that's non-random. Only the shorter ones are getting through and then surviving and reproducing better. So we can think of this in two different categories here. First, the individuals in a population vary in ways that are heritable, and that's the random part. And it's random as a result of random mutation, which generates new alleles. And in sexually reproducing species, additionally, there's meiosis, which shuffles those alleles by crossing over an independent assortment, and there's fertilization, which is bringing together the parental gametes in a way that's random. And so you can see that sexual reproduction leads to more variability in the population, more different combinations of alleles, which provides more raw material for natural selection to operate on. This variability in the population, which is random, is increased by sexual reproduction. Now, the second part of natural selection is that in a particular environment, some traits are going to be more helpful than others in the struggle to survive and reproduce. In our example, it was short stature. And this is because more offspring are produced than the environment can support. So there's more offspring than the resources to support them. And as a result, there's a struggle to survive and reproduce. There's competition between organisms in a population to get the resources like food, water, shelter, mates in order to survive and reproduce. And so we get differential or differing survival and reproduction. So there's differential survival and reproduction. And again, we can see that there's a random aspect to natural selection. That's this part over here. But there's also a non-random aspect. The selection is not random. It depends on the characteristics of the particular environment. Here, the size of the door to the meadow with resources. A few more things to note. First, it's important to recognize that populations evolve. Individuals don't. Recall that a population is a group of the same species of organism living in a particular area at one time. And it's the populations that evolve as the allele frequency changes in that population. So in our example above, as we get greater survival and reproduction of the short blobs, the alleles that are coding for short stature are going to become more prevalent in subsequent generations. It's not that any individual is changing. No blob is getting shorter themselves. And so that's an important distinction to make. By the way, just to note that Darwin didn't know about genes. The concept of genes was being developed around the same time that Darwin was working, but he wasn't aware of them. Also, natural selection operates on heritable traits, not acquired traits. By acquired traits, we mean traits that are acquired during an individual's lifetime. So, for example, if one of the blobs managed to stretch itself to get taller, but that wasn't in its genes, that wouldn't have any effect on its offspring. It wouldn't have taller offspring. The concept that acquired traits can be transmitted is called Lamarckism, after another scientist. And in fact, it's made a bit of a comeback because we now know that certain acquired traits actually can be transmitted epigenetically through tags and modifications of histones and DNA. But that's a different topic. In general, natural selection operates on heritable traits in the DNA, not acquired traits, with this exception about epigenetics, which is a current area of research. Also, variation in the population pre-exists selection. In our example, we had shorter and taller blobs to begin with. If there was no variation in the population, if they were all short or all tall, there would be no evolution by natural selection because there would be no variation for that selection to operate on. Also, lastly, just a note about a common phrase you'll hear with regard to evolution: survival of the fittest. This often gets misunderstood. Just as I said above, fit here means how well suited an organism is to its environment. You can think of it as like a glove fitting a hand. They are better suited to each other if there is a closer fit. It doesn't have anything to do with the kind of fitness you might associate with strength or speed. In some circumstances, strength or speed will be advantageous, but in others it might be quite the opposite. So just to note, not to confuse what fit means here. Fitness is a measure of an organism's ability to survive and reproduce in a particular environment. If the environment changes, what would count as fitness would change. If all of a sudden above, the food was out of reach overhead instead of through a small doorway, then the taller blobs would be the best fit for that environment. So that's an introduction to evolution by natural selection.